when we start to create a national cybersecurity incident response plan, we have to be able to relate to any laws that are existing there, and they should support each other. So, for example, one of the first goals is increase confidence and trust in all sectors and types of cyber activity. The second one being protect critical infrastructure and developing response capability. The next one being protect national interests, security, and new and traditional threats. The fourth one being strengthen the digital economy. The fifth one being raise awareness and promote cooperation and collaboration in cybersecurity. The sixth one being promote a culture of proper use of cybersecurity. The seventh one being promote prevention and suppression of cybercrime. And the eighth one being promote cooperation of national and international cybersecurity activities. So what I want you to take away from this is, as you are working together with the NCSA and the soon-to-be established National CSIRT, what you contribute to the creation of the National Cybersecurity Incident Response Plan. How would your needs align to what these goals are, and you should take into consideration these specific goals as this document is being drafted up. Next slide, please. And just following that same train of thought, considerations for an NSERP alignment with laws and regulations. So we need to consider what policies, laws, and regulations are in place or are planned to support these national cybersecurity interests. There may be some laws that are specific to the specific service that you provide to your constituents or your stakeholders that you have to abide to. As I was going through the documents, I saw that there are specific regulators that may have some input as well to what these laws or things that may be requirements that have to be there. So taking that into consideration. The other thing, the next bullet we have is who has the responsibility for these policies, laws, and regulations. So we have to be able to be clear on to who has the authority to and responsibility for these policies, laws, and regulations. But in the same vein, who has the authority to implement and enforce these policies, laws, and regulations? So once we start to develop policy, we have to be able to have someone from the top down that would back up or give us what needed to implement a solution or implement these policies. Is there a reference in the NSERP in these laws and any reporting requirements? So we'll need to take that into consideration as well. Do the laws include reference to the authority of the NSERP or any escalation activities? So there may be, we'll see a little bit later, we get into a little bit more detail as to what the Cybersecurity Act say on what needs to be reported, how that may need to be reported, and what too. And then from an international perspective, we will consider how the nation interacts with other nations, aligns with international norms, what international aspects need to be included in the NSERP. So one of the goals that is identified in the cyber strategy is to collaborate with other nations. So that would need to be taken into consideration as well. Next slide, please.
พร้อมแล้วครับครับ0332น้องอะไรนะครับ
Yes, so example of Thailand Cybersecurity Act of 2019.
สวัสดี
Yes, thank you. I'll share what I was able to find about the Cybersecurity Act in the chat as well. Just 1 second here. So the legislation aims to combat cyber threats and equip law enforcement personnel with the ability to protect the country's digital infrastructure. It does allow the government to track, monitor, and access digital data if it deems that there's a cyber threat that is damaging to the critical digital infrastructure of the Kingdom of Thailand. It requires obligations for key and non-key infrastructure. So that was interesting to note also. We'll talk about that a little bit later as well. But it also requires the implementation of security measures, the appointment of a security officer at all the agencies, a notification of stakeholders of cybersecurity incidents, reporting of cybersecurity incidents, and the investigation of any breaches that have happened. Okay, can we go to the next slide, please? So we are going to now talk about what are some of the components of an NSERP. And next slide. So for example, what is the mission and scope of this document? So we would need to identify the mission of what this endeavor is. The document then should be to identify what we're trying to accomplish. And within that, identify what is the scope. So within what parameters will this document work? So we'll need to identify that. We'll also need to identify some guiding principles. So for example, what are some of the guidelines that we need to apply for this specific document? Is there any relationship to national preparedness systems as well? Is there any alignment with the national cyber strategy? Any alignment with national cyber laws and regulations? So we'll have to pull all this information together when we start to draft up our NSERP. And then any authority for operations and who gave that authority. So will the authority come from the NSERP, or the national CSERT that's being established? Will it come from the NCSA? And then we will also identify any cyber roles and responsibilities for the different entities or business or organizations that we're working with, as well as we previously mentioned, what is some incident criteria, along with some reporting requirements. And next slide, please. Thank you. Communications and notifications plans. So we've already mentioned who needs to be notified. What does that look like? Do we have some type of a plan? Do we have an escalation plan? Who are the key stakeholders in this communication? Is there, this could be based on the different types of incidents that we have identified, or how these incidents are categorized. Will also, a component for the NSERP then will also be the workflows and coordinating structures, which may differ for private industry and maybe different for critical infrastructure, for the government, or how we interact with international or other international CSERTs or nations. And we're going to work through some of these further on in the presentation. Next slide, please. So we wanted to show an example of the incident response plan for the Australian government. And I'll also share that here in the chat, if you're interested to look at. This one is more of a brochure based. It's 7 pages, but it does show some of the key components that an NSERP should have. So it provides the context, it provides an introduction, it provides the scope of what the national CSERT or the National Incident Response Plan is capable of or is responsible for. It identifies some key terms and concepts. It also identifies some national coordination arrangements. So this would also be something that could be aligned with the roles and responsibilities. So for example, what should a cybersecurity incident occur, what agency is responsible for performing a specific action? So these things all need to be outlined and formalized, and then again, may socialize to everyone that would be involved. Also here, we see that they are also outlining the strategic principles, the benefits of being enrolled with the national CSERT or the National Cybersecurity Incident Response Plan, and then exercising the arrangement that has been provided through this document, and governance and review. Next slide, please. Then we also have the incident response plan for New Zealand, which is the Coordinated Incident Management System. This is more of a framework. I'll also provide it in the chat if you're interested in looking at it. It is a framework, and this specific document is it's a longer document. It provides specific protocols and systems, specific response levels for incident classification, the SIMS function itself, an application of SIMS, and types of response levels, as well as some appendices. So I wanted to provide these examples for you so that when you start to work together to draft the National Cybersecurity Incident Response Plan, you have some ideas of how other nations in the region may have achieved this. Next slide, please. So NSERP guiding principles. U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, some recommended principles are a shared responsibility. So this means that you are collaborating at the national level with your national CSIRT and the National Cybersecurity Agency to do incident management. You would also apply a risk-based response to how you're doing incident management. You would be respecting affected entities. And again, this would be where your communications plan come into play. So there should be some rules in place as to what gets communicated, how it gets communicated, who it gets communicated to. This could be it could be related to the type of incident that has occurred. It could be related to the specific sector that was impacted. Those would all be related to how you're respecting the privacy of the affected entities. Another guiding principle is the unity of a governmental effort. So working together, different agencies working together to mitigate a national level cybersecurity incident. And then finally, enabling and restoring and recovery. So what needs to happen to get back to normal operations and bring back society to a place where it was before the incident occurred. And with that, we have another Menti question. Yes. The question is, what causes national cybersecurity strategies and cybersecurity capabilities to be misaligned? So please go to menti.com and enter the code to answer the question. So we're seeing insufficient in human skills, money, or technical skills. Whole of government's vision not clear. Communication. National strategies will guide us to walk along the way that should be and be not misaligned. Following capability. Lack of understanding of cybersecurity impact. So we have a few with communication, lack of communication, awareness and communication and lack of skill, communication. So for all the people mentioning communication, this is what I was mentioning, socializing the plan, right? So once the National Cybersecurity Incident Response Plan has been created, it then has to be socialized. So everyone has to be aware that this exists and what is expected of them and what they are responsible for. Unclear objectives and responsibilities of related entities. Right, so this is what we were mentioning earlier about cybersecurity roles and responsibilities. So what would be the responsibility of
อันนี้มันมีแต่กล่องเล็กอ่ะมีแต่กล่องเล็กอ่ะปิงโก้ปิงโก้ไม่มีเว้ยไหนว่าปิงโก้
Sorry. Can folks unmute themselves if they're not briefing? It's hard to hear.
Thank you. Misleading and national risk analysis and cyber incident. High-level management of government communications. Don't have an answer procedure. Undefine the goal to align strategy. Miscommunication. So it looks like the majority of people are saying communications. Yes. So when we talk about this communication, as we mentioned earlier, everyone has to be on the same page. So there's a lot of planning that goes into the plan. So you have to start to collaborate and work together. And as we mentioned yesterday, build these relationships with these other agencies and other groups to be able to work together and collaborate to bring this, to create this document and bring it to fruition. Robin, would you like to add anything here?
Thank you, Angel. Yes, I think that everyone has done a really good job putting some of those key issues. I think lack of skill is very interesting because that without the right expertise, you may not understand and you may cause the strategies to be misaligned. The lack of integration, and certainly people were putting conflict of interest between some of the different areas. So these are some of the key issues, and we'll see these come up again in the challenges when we talk about those later. So thank you all very much. And we are at our break point for this evening for the first break. And so we will stop now and have a 10-minute break. And when we come back, we will pick up with looking at some of the other components in more depth for a national cyber incident response plan. Thank you very much. Thank you, Angel. And thank you, Joanna.
Excuse me. During the break, I would like to talk to Thai colleague for the administration. So please let me talk in Thai.
Of course, go ahead.
Thank you. สวัสดีครับสำหรับผู้เข้าร่วมการอบรมของทาง Mitre เป็นวันที่3นะครับวันนี้หัวข้อหลักๆที่ได้รับการอบรมเนี่ยเป็นหัวข้อที่เขาค่อนข้างทำกันบ้านมาดีมากนะครับสังเกตว่าเขาไปรีเสิร์ชทั้งในส่วนของตัว National Cyber Security Strategy ของเราด้วยนะครับแล้วก็เป็นตัวความเชื่อมโยงต่างๆนะครับก็ถือว่าเป็นโอกาสอันดีนะครับที่เราได้ฟังจากเขานะครับทีนี้อาจจะในเชิงของแอดมินนะครับอยากจะประสานงานว่าขอให้ท่านไหนที่ไม่ได้นำเสนอนะครับรบกวนท่านระมัดระวังในเรื่องการเปิดไมค์นะครับจะได้ไม่เป็นการรบกวนกับทางผู้บรรยายนะครับแล้วก็รวมถึงถ้าเกิดท่านมีคำถามนะครับหรือว่ามีประเด็นนะครับท่านสามารถพิมพ์ในแชทเป็นข้อความภาษาอังกฤษได้เลยนะครับสังเกตว่าทางทีมเขาจะค่อนข้างยินดีมากนะครับที่ได้ประเด็นคำถามข้อสงสัยนะครับก็อย่าได้กังวลเรื่องภาษาอังกฤษครับก็สามารถที่จะสื่อสารผ่านแชทได้เต็มที่นะครับผมมั่นใจว่าเขาเห็นข้อความจากฝ่ายเราที่สอบถามเข้าไปเนี่ยเขาดีใจมากๆนะครับก็ยังเปิดสำหรับ Open สำหรับทุกท่านนะครับถ้ามีคำถามมีข้อสงสัยท่านอยากรู้อะไรเพิ่มเติมท่านพิมพ์เข้าไปในแชทเป็นภาษาอังกฤษได้เลยครับแล้วก็ถ้าเป็นงานแอดมินนะครับเรื่องอื่นๆที่ท่านไม่ได้รับความสะดวกนะครับก็ท่านสามารถพิมพ์ข้อความเป็นภาษาไทยแจ้งไว้ในแชทได้เช่นเดียวกันนะครับเดี๋ยวทีมน้องๆแอดมินผมก็จะเข้าไปดูแลท่านนะครับแต่ในส่วนของพวกcourse material พวกนี้ขอเรียนเน้นย้ำอีกทีนะครับว่าได้ขอให้กับทุกท่านเรียบร้อยแล้วนะครับแล้วก็วิธีการก็คือเดี๋ยวเราได้จากเขาเสร็จเนี่ย เราก็จะเอาใส่ไว้ในพื้นที่ที่เป็นแชร์ไดรฟ์นะครับแล้วก็จะแชร์ให้ทุกท่านเนี่ยทางอีเมลนะครับคือไม่ได้แชร์ให้กับคนอื่นนะครับอย่างเช่นเราไม่สามารถแชร์ material พวกนี้ให้กับทางกองทัพให้หน่วยข่าวกรองหรือว่าหน่วยงานบังคับใช้กฎหมายได้นะครับก็ขออนุญาตเน้นย้ำว่าที่แชร์ให้ท่านเนี่ยก็ขออนุญาตว่าท่านอย่าไปแชร์ต่อให้บุคคลอื่นโดยเฉพาะกลุ่มที่เป็นทหารตำรวจบังคับใช้กฎหมายหน่วยงานด้านข่าวกรองนะครับต้องขออนุญาตไม่ไปแชร์ต่อนะครับแล้วก็ขออนุญาตประชาสัมพันธ์อีกอย่างหนึ่งนะครับก็คือว่าเดี๋ยวเรียนครบทั้ง6วันเสร็จนะครับก็คือมีสัปดาห์หน้าอีก3วันนะครับทางทีมแอดมินเนี่ยจะทำรายชื่อแล้วก็คอนเฟิร์มกับท่านอีกทีนะครับว่ามีท่านไหนที่เรียนจนครบทั้ง6วันบ้างนะครับก็อันนั้นจะเป็นรายชื่อที่เราจะพยายามเร่งออกใบเซอร์นะครับหรือเป็นใบประกาศนียบัตรให้ท่านนะครับต้องขออภัยสำหรับบางท่านที่อาจจะเข้าเรียนไม่ครบนะครับอันนี้ไม่สามารถที่จะออกใบประกาศนียบัตรให้ได้จริงๆนะครับก็ท่านต้องเรียนครบทุกวันนะครับก็สำหรับท่านที่ไม่ได้เรียนครบทุกวันด้วยท่านติดภารกิจสำคัญเร่งด่วนอันนี้ก็เข้าใจกันได้นะครับแต่ต้องขออภัยว่าถ้าเกิดท่านเรียนไม่ครบทุกวันเราไม่สามารถออกใบประกาศให้กับท่านได้จริงๆนะครับก็ต้องขออภัยในส่วนนี้ครับในส่วนอื่นๆครับไม่แน่ใจว่าท่านไหนอยากจะพูดคุยสอบถามเพิ่มเติมไหมครับระหว่างพักเบรกครับมีไหมครับมีท่านไหนที่อยากจะสอบถามพูดคุยเพิ่มเติมไหมครับหรือจะเสนอแนะก็ได้ครับครับถ้าไม่มีงั้นก็ขอบคุณทุกท่านมากครับครับ
Is that typing I hear?
I don't know what that is.
Okay, we'll be getting ready to get back in another minute. All right, we'll get started again. And I do want to call out that we are getting to a piece of the discussion tonight that will address the question that was in chat last night about incident response time. So I wanted I meant to mention that at the very beginning, But when we get to severity levels, we will be talking about that. So I did want to mention that. All right, so we're going to continue to talk about some of the components, some of the things to think about when you're developing your national cyber incident response plan. So when we take a look at the plan itself, one of the things that we have to think about is who has authority for the plan itself, for not only its operation, but just the initial establishment of that plan. So each country may decide to do that in a different way, but recommendations and best practice say it's good to have some type of a project team or a council to lead the development effort, and that you want to make sure that you've got good representation from key stakeholders. You want to have them involved from the beginning so that it's not a surprise to you or to them, and that they can provide you with insight as far as their concerns, their ideas, best practices they may have on their own, who have seen, but specifically what their needs and requirements are. And you work together to try to get as much consensus as possible, knowing that you can never get all consensus. There's probably some give and take or negotiation that needs to go on. We also want to make sure that whoever is responsible for the establishment of the plan keeps all of the stakeholders that are involved in that development up to date, and possibly even members of the public, if you want them to know what the status is, if people are asking, or other key parts of the government, or other key stakeholders. We want to look at then formalizing the plan, developing it in a way that it would have authority from the way it's developed, that it includes that authority in the plan, who is providing the authority from what level of government or Security Council or NCSA, that is included in the beginning, so there's no question about that the plan is fully approved and has full authority. We want to make sure that it gets published, and that it's published in multiple different methods and multiple different venues, so that it can be socialized, as Angel was saying, as much as possible. And ensure that those things that we've been talking about are included. How do people report? What do people report? How do things get escalated? Where do the cyber laws align or tie into the National Incident Response Plan? And as we said before, sometimes some of these acts or some of these laws or some of these documents have already been developed. And so you can look at references or maybe updating an appendix or a pointer, so that at least you know that if you're reading something that's already established, like the cybersecurity strategy, and now there's a new incident response plan for the nation at the national level, that you can refer to that so that people see that they're tied together. We want to make sure, too, that as different types of information may be reported in the reporting requirements, that privacy is taken into account. So what data has to be kept private, what data should not be shared, and is that part of the National Cyber Incident Response Plan? And as Angel said, it's so important to socialize and market the plan, have sessions, have people go out and talk to different organizations or different government groups or different citizens groups to let them know that the plan is out there. We've seen, for example, with the plan from the United States, there was a comment period where anyone from the public could make comments and submit comments about the plan. So is there some way for people to provide their input and their feedback? As far as who owns the plan, whoever that group is, they must make sure the plan is kept active. The worst thing that could happen is that a plan is developed and then it's just either, left on a digital site or it's put on a shelf somewhere and nobody ever pulls it out and looks at it. So it must be kept active, which means as the environment changes, as any cyber laws change, as cyber strategy priorities change, the plan should be reviewed and should be updated. As far as any type of ownership, you will need to decide in any country who that ownership would be, whether it's a cybersecurity center, a council, the national CSIRT, or even a specific government ministry. We've seen that in very different cases. But we want to make sure that all of those governance aspects have been documented, are in place, and that they're coordinated so there is not that misalignment between these foundational aspects. So we know that as we look at cyber governance, that nations are governed by rules, laws, policies, and various authorities. And that the governance, when we talk about it, includes not only those types of policies and rules and mandates and regulations, but they also include a hierarchy of, if we want to call them stakeholders or key organizational people that are responsible for the establishment, the maintenance, the update of cybersecurity issues. And each nation has to establish that cyber governance hierarchy, including, as we said, as Angel went through, talked about some of the documents, but also think about the people and what type of positions, what type of committees, and what their roles and responsibilities are. In the Cybersecurity Act of 2019, you see the very beginning of that lists various different cyber governance entities. You'll see things as the National Cybersecurity Committee, the Cybersecurity Regulating Committee, the Office of National Cybersecurity Committee. So a wide variety of committees, these different governance groups, and it lists the different duties and powers that they have. So that is something that is important to ensure that if they play any role in the national incident response, that is outlined, and that who is responsible for the national incident response, that the cyber governance people and documents are outlined for the National Cyber Incident Response Plan. When we think about the implementation of governance aspects, you're really thinking about, too, who's responsible for the enforcement of the rules, including the National Incident Response Plan, monitoring for violations of that plan. Are there any type of penalties for not adhering to the plan? Who's going to receive the incident and vulnerability report? And who responds to these violations or attacks or incidents? And there may be multiple different entities involved. So what are their relationships? Who's responsible for what type of activities? For responding to various different types of malicious activities. And again, think about how these governance pieces are implemented and documented. We're going to move on to the incident criteria and incidents of national importance. So Angel was talking a little bit about the incident criteria. So in that case, we're really thinking about the thresholds or the benchmarks for what is an incident. When does something hit a threshold that says, okay, this has now become an incident, and how is that incident going to be handled? And when we're talking at the national level, we're looking at specific types of incidents that need to be defined. So those are called incidents of national importance. And in this case, what we often see is that a country defines those incidents that are of importance at that national level. It may be certain types of high-level cybercrime or other specific types of crimes are involved. It's certainly not going to be every single type of crime, because there may be misdemeanors and low-level crimes. So you have to determine what types of crime are of national importance. And it may be what type of critical infrastructures are affected. But usually, if national security is at risk, if there's any type of spying or espionage or terrorism, those may be incidents of national importance. And certainly when critical infrastructures are under attack or a threat of attack that would take them out of service or impact the citizens that use those critical infrastructures. So a country can define their incidents of national importance and what is relevant to them. But that is something that in the National Cyber Incident Response Plan you need to think about. Do you have specific incidents of national importance? Have they already been outlined in specific cybercrime laws or in the Cybersecurity Act? Or are there additional types of incidents of national importance that will need added and called out? When we look at general incident criteria, besides those of national importance, any incident response plan will lay out what is the incident criteria, really what type of incident someone should report. Are there any classifications or even subclassifications of incidents? For example, you might decide that one of the classifications would be malware. So the top level classification could be malware, and then it could be a subclassification of a specific type of malware. It could be ransomware, and then maybe even more detailed would be the actual name of that ransomware or multiple names of that particular ransomware. So you have to think about what that incident criteria is. And that's one of the things that we've seen when multiple organizations are trying to work together to have a coordinated incident response. They have to make sure that they are defining incidents and the incident classification in the same manner. Otherwise, they may misunderstand information that is shared between them. Two situations where we've seen this come into play is that at one point in time, there was a group that was trying to work with a particular way to exchange data about incidents. And they were using a particular format to do that exchange, but they realized that they had not defined what the term incident meant. So before that they could actually share the information, they actually had to go and define what incident was and what types of incidents so that they were speaking the same language. We also saw an instance where we were helping a university, and the university had 26 different campuses or 23 different campuses. And when they were first starting to build a coordinated incident response plan across those campuses, they found out that each one of the campuses had their own definitions and their own criteria for incidents. So they needed to come together with that type of incident criteria and classification so, again, they could share information in a meaningful fashion. And then one of the other parts of the incident criteria is that severity metrics or severity levels, which are usually tied to impact and what type of assets are being affected. When you're looking at collecting information about an incident and using some type of incident tracking system to collect and track that information, you can see in this case there are some sample fields that might be used. These are just examples. This is not necessarily what you might use to build your incident tracking system and the type of data that you would collect. But notice that there are some pieces of information that need to be collected after you're handling the incident. So we're not surprised that there's the contact information for who reported it. There's a lot of different dates and times that may be reported, such as the time that the report was made, the time the actual activity occurred, the time that it was actually discovered, the description of the problem, including has anyone taken any type of actions already? And of course, that important piece, the impact and the scope, the category, and the priority. Also, who is it assigned to for handling, any action items they need to perform, and then sometimes we see organizations collecting the cost of damage or the cost of recovery so they can look at how much this particular incident costs. We don't always see that as some piece of information that's collected. certainly how long it took to resolve, and what the resolution was. It happens very often that a lot of times people will only collect the information on the left-hand side of the screen. They'll only do that initial information when they first receive the incident. But it's just as important to collect and to document what type of information, what type of activities that you took, who you talked to, and how the incident was resolved, so you can use it for other similar types of incidents. So just a little bit to think about when you're reporting incidents at the national level, and what is going to be asked for. What are the specific pieces of information that will be asked to be reported to follow the National Cyber Incident Response Plan. Now we get into the severity levels. And there are a lot of different types of severity levels or models out there that people can use that will help when you're looking at the severity level, you're usually looking at impact, and you're going to use that to help determine the urgency and the criticality of the asset affected, the urgency of response, and who needs to be involved, the type of expertise that's needed. So that severity levels and impact are so very important. So determining and laying out those types of levels as part of the incident response plan at the national level will be a key activity to complete. Different groups use different types of levels or schemas, some like quantitative, some like qualitative. The two listed below are not related. They're just two different examples. So qualitative is high, medium, low, and it's kind of subjective as far as what's a high severity. And this is based on the threat source is highly motivated and sufficiently capable in controls to prevent the vulnerability from being exercised or ineffective. So in this case, it's looking kind of at the capability and the controls. So you really have to think about, am I using qualitative, quantitative? What are my different levels that I'm going to use? How do I define that? Can I make it unambiguous? It's a little bit harder when it's qualitative. When we take a look at quantitative, in this case, looking at what type of action is needed. So this might be in an internal organization, like a government ministry or a manufacturing organization. And so in this case, we look at executive attention is needed to handle this particular threat or incident. The threat is between 75 to 99% likely to occur within the next week or has occurred within the industry or the critical infrastructure sector in the last week. So a lot more quantitative involved. So there's not one best practice recommended, but you have to think about what works best for your NCIRP. When we think back to the session that we had on Monday about risk management and risk scores, and when we talked about, when Barbara and Matt talked about impact and likelihood and the risk scores, those can be used also for severity levels. Impact is often used to determine severity levels. Likelihood of something actually occurring, and then combining the impact of the likelihood for a risk score. It might also be what type of asset is affected and how critical it is to the operation of the nation. Now, what we want to do with severity levels and incident response is tie them together. And when we look at being able to identify severity, the criticality, or the priority for response, we can outline that in a matrix or some type of table or just a document if you want it to be part of your National Cyber Incident Response Plan. And again, this is an example. It's not comprehensive. It's just some examples of key important fields. So once you know what your severity level or criticality is, capturing that information, defining it, you have to define it as best possible so that it's as clear as possible. And we found that if you give a couple examples of what do we mean by what types of incidents would be a critical or a severity level high, or needs attention, or, a 10 on the risk score. And then we get into the question that came up yesterday about the response time and improving your incident response plan. And that is tying to the criticality and the type of incidents. What is the initial response time required? Now, this can get a little bit tricky. One of the things you can do is lay out, at least when someone reports an incident, what is the initial response time required to acknowledge them? This might be 24 hours. I've seen some organizations say 3 days. You have to see what works best with your stakeholders and your constituents. But if you try to mandate a response time requirement as far as that this has to be resolved within this many days, we have seen organizations do that. But you have to be flexible, because there are situations where, because of the scope, or because of new information that's coming out, or because things are escalating fast and maybe there's no fix, that you cannot meet that response requirement. So if you are going to put initial response times required, you have to think very hard about what it is and ensure that they're feasible, and ensure that they can be flexible and that there are exceptions. And that's where some of the feasibility comes in. You can't make things too tight where someone could not, it's not physically possible for that to be resolved. So that is very tricky. And that's why I highlighted it in yellow, because that was one of the questions that came up. The acknowledgement piece is much easier. You can acknowledge something. But as far as mandating when certain types of incidents have to be completely resolved, that's a little harder. You may have better luck with some type of response time for at least, an initial understanding of the incident as far as what you know to state, but knowing that you still probably have more information to collect. Now, this can tie also into the timeframes for ongoing response. For certain types of critical or severity levels, and I'm just going to use the generic term high, you may say, okay, the staff has to continue working on this 24/7. We have to have people working round the clock, because the severity level is so high for such a critical asset that we can't take any time to stop. So that's another thing to think about as far as tying severity levels and response. And then the last two really deal with what Angel was talking about, with communication and notification requirements. So that can be tied to severity levels. If you have specific levels, who needs to get notified that something bad has been reported, you don't know much about it, maybe senior management, maybe specific type of security councils, maybe specific people within the National CSIRT or NCSA. So think about, for specific levels of severity or criticality, what are your communication requirements? Who needs to know immediately? Who needs to know within 2 hours? Who can wait a day or two? And that can be laid out in your communications plan. Think about the same thing with any type of escalation plan. So I hope that answered the question that came up yesterday. Just an example of severity level by type of activity. So showing different types, the criteria in this case is different types of malicious activity, and showing and defining low, medium, high severity level. And as Angel mentioned before, in the Thailand Cybersecurity Act of 2019, it breaks down the cyber threats into these 3 tiers. There's definitions, and also if you take a look at some of this information, you can see that more information about this This gets talked about in Part 4 of the Cybersecurity Act in Section 60. And you can see that there are a lot, if you read that, you'll see that for critical level threats, there are a lot of tied response activities or other types of notifications, communications, or escalations or actions that happen. So thinking about how this ties into your National Cyber Incident Response Plan and what are the different ways and responses that need to occur, and fleshing that out more will be a key part of your NCIRP. Okay, so I'm going to turn it back over to Angel, and he's going to talk about cyber roles and responsibilities.
Great, thanks, Robin. Next slide, please. So the NCIRP should outline roles and responsibilities. This should be part of the documented NCIRP, and if possible, it should be included into the National Cyber Strategy. Roles and responsibilities should include, but are not limited to, the owner of the plan. So once this plan has been created, who is the owner of it? Who is responsible for this plan? And should any changes have to happen to the plan, who is this person or this entity? Would this be, for example, the NCSA? Would it be the National CSIRT? Or would it be a combination of both? And then also along with that is, who is the executor of the plan? So as you may know, within cybersecurity incident response teams, once an incident has been detected, the CSIRT will be enacted to respond to the incident. So in this case, who is the executor of this plan? Should an incident be detected, who enables the next step or who turns on the plan? As we show here, this could be multiple entities, but if that's the case, then we have to identify within the document the role of each one and the expected requirements, what their role and their function is in the incident response process. We should also outline who are our stakeholders and who are our participants. Again, you describe the type of participation, activities, and responsibilities. So for example, within a sector-based environment or sector CSIRT ecosystem, what is the sector responsible for and what is the National CSIRT responsible for? It could be that the National CSIRT serves as a coordinating function. So a sector determines that an event has happened. They notify the National CSIRT. The National CSIRT then determines that this incident is worthy of sharing with the rest of any of the other sectors or any of the other entities within that specific sector that need to be notified. And again, this would be based on the type of incident and the classification of the incident, and how we saw yesterday with using MISP, how different type of incidents and threats can be categorized and can be shared, that information can be shared that way. Next slide, please. Cybersecurity roles and responsibilities. The cyber entities and associated roles and responsibilities for the country should identify those organizations that play a role in performing or receiving cybersecurity services or activities. The NCIRP should align and recognize these roles. NCIRP stakeholders may not be completely inclusive of this group. So for example, there may be a requirement that there has to be a specific role. And while we were looking through the Cybersecurity Act, one of the things that stood out was the Act identifies that there needs to be a creation of a role, that of a cybersecurity officer or a security officer at each government entity. So that is a requirement that needs to be complied with. This will also determine, maybe this is the individual in the organization who is the person that coordinates or is the point of contact with the national CSIRT or with the other sector CSIRTs, as we've mentioned with communication already, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we move forward. So can we go on to the next slide, please? So now we're going to talk about incident reporting requirements. Next slide, please. So as part of the NSERP, how incidents are to be reported should be detailed. So this includes the mechanism for reporting, information to be reported, timeframes for reporting, expectations for response and handling, coordination and escalation for handling. So when we talk about a mechanism for reporting, our NSERP should identify, we are going to use these 3 or 4 different methods of reporting an incident. For example, we have worked with another nation that has their national CSIRT has a web page on their website that's for reporting an incident. It's open to the public. It's open to other individuals. That may be something that you may want to include as a reporting mechanism. I know that you may or may not get legitimate information, but it is something that's open there to the public. They also had created an app. So the constituents and the general public would be able to download an app to their phone, and they were able to report an incident that way. They also had created a dedicated phone line that constituents could call into, and this is for the National CSIRT, could call into the National CSIRT and report any anomalous activity or anything that they believed was an incident. As well as they also had an email address or a generic email box that constituents could email in and to the National CSIRT for any malicious or any weird or anomalous activity that has been detected. Consider using an automated response for acknowledgement. So for example, if you do institute these type of communication methods, there needs to be a way that whoever is initiating this communication gets a response back to say, we have received your notification and we are working on it, something along those lines. Next slide, please.
If I add something to that.
Sure, go ahead.
Sure. One of the things that you have to be careful about with the automated response, though, is sometimes you get something very specific and high level. And there was a situation where someone reported something and put in a lot of detailed information and got the automated response back. And they felt that they were not getting the right attention. They felt that they were just getting something that was just standard reply, and they decided they weren't going to work with that CSIRT anymore. So as you're actually developing any type of automated response, it's important that you outline, just as Angel was saying, what the expectations are, and that say that if this was high level, we'll get back to you as soon as possible or right away, or something in there so that they don't feel that they're being ignored. And we did that in the early years of CERT-CC. We put in an automated response because we've got so many incidents submitted that we couldn't respond to them in enough time and acknowledge them, and people felt like, again, we weren't responding back to them. So the acknowledgement helped a lot. Thanks. Thank you, Angel.
Thanks, Robin. And then also information to be reported. So what fields? So what information do you want to receive when someone reports an incident? You would want the type of incident that they believe is occurring, the time that it was detected, where it was detected, what they believe is occurring. So you would want to identify in your NCIRP what information is necessary in order for you to start to create a ticket and keep a record of this incident. And then also you may want to identify there, or you should want to identify time frames for reporting. So once something is detected, what is the minimum amount of time that whoever detected it should notify the national CSIRT or should notify any other entity? So this needs to be identified as well. And this may be related to we could trace this back to incident classification. So if it's something that we believe is of a critical nature, maybe that should be reported immediately. But if it's something that we believe that may be of low importance, maybe that can wait 2 or 4 hours. But those timeframes have to be identified somewhere in your national in your INSERP. And then also you would want to document there the expectations for response and handling. So once someone reports an incident, what should the reporter or your constituent or stakeholder expect? You would explain there, we would create a ticket. The ticket would be given to an analyst. The analyst would then determine the appropriate next steps to handle this. And you may also include there when you will notify this specific stakeholder that of the steps being taken to mitigate whatever the situation is, whatever the incident is. Next slide, please. Here are some of the mechanisms that we have mentioned briefly before. Consider the format and mechanism for collecting, tracking, and storing reports. So mechanisms for reporting can include the web portal. So you may want to include on your web page, or if the NCSA gives a page to the national CSIRT, there could be something there that users could, or your stakeholders could click on to enter more information. It could be an incident reporting form that you could also have an electronic version of that your stakeholders could click on something and fill the information in. You could have automated forms. As I previously mentioned, it could be a phone service. It could be something where you establish a hotline for any type of cybersecurity incidents, or if the protocol is to first call into some type of service desk, and then that gets routed to the next level, then that could be something that you implement. You could do texting or social media reporting mechanisms as well. And then, as we just mentioned, the auto acknowledgement to the responder, that the information that we acknowledge that you have reported some type of malicious or anomalous activity, and we are now working on whatever our next steps are. And then also you would want to have in the NCIRP reporting requirements and instructions. So that going back to what fields are necessary, what information is necessary in order for the analyst that's receiving that information to begin to troubleshoot or to identify exactly what is happening. Next slide, please. So what are some incident tracking mechanisms? This could be a ticket tracking system, some type of solution where these fields are already created there, and the analyst would then just have to input the information into this ticket tracking system. It would create a numbering system. Often many of the ticket tracking systems also have some type of knowledge management solution built into them, where the analysts could search specific terms to see what has happened previously or what records are already stored on an event. Storage could be either some type of a database on site or in the cloud. You may also want to identify here how this information that's being collected, how this information is protected. So now we're talking about, we're receiving information about cybersecurity incidents. We may want to have that in a separate environment, in a segregated environment, where it's protected and only specific people within the national CSIRT, and maybe even the NCSA have access to view the data that's being collected there for when they are troubleshooting and managing the incident. Mechanisms for visualization of collected information. These could be dashboards. Often these tools have some type of dashboard functionality that could be incorporated into your reporting structure. Statistics and other news feeds could be available. Next slide, please. So now we are going to talk about communication and notification plans, procedures, and mechanisms. Next slide, please. Communication and notification plans and procedures. The NSERP should include what type of communications and notifications are required. This means who needs to know what and when. As part of the NSERP, this information can be included there, or it could be a separate communication plan, or it can be used as a reference that is not actually in the NSERP. It could have supporting procedures with instructions for executing this communications plan. So as we can see in the diagram, we have in the center the incident response team. So based on the type of incident or the type of information that has been collected, the team will decide then who they need to communicate with. So this could be either the internet service provider, the incident reporter, law enforcement agencies, depending on what exactly has been detected and is happening, software and support vendors, and customers, constituents, and the media. But what we're getting with this communication plan is who needs to know what and when. So again, this is going to go back to the type of incidents that is happening. It's going to be related to your incident classification table as the example that we viewed earlier, just generically. And that would also help dictate how we could go about communicating about a specific incident. So again, if it's a high level incident, the NSERP may say, if it's a high level incident, we have to escalate this to some other higher level bureau. Whoever the NCSA would report to, they may need to be notified of this. But if it's a lower level type of incident, maybe it doesn't need to be escalated to the next level. Maybe you keep it internal and you handle it at your specific level. Next slide, please. So a point of contact list, the list should be included in the NSERP. It's usually held and maintained whoever is responsible for the document for the NSERP. It could be the National CSERT or the NCSA. The list should contain the various points of contacts, their names, their organizations, and any contact information for key collaborators or coordinating responders. So this means, should an incident happen at this national level, and I need to communicate with someone at another bureau or agency, who is that person? What is their role? And how do I communicate with them? Is it through email? Is it through a phone call? That type of information would be in this specific contact list. Also, you would include in the contact list point of contacts for law enforcement. Should you have to engage law enforcement, any other CSERTs, cybersecurity incident response teams. So if we are talking about a national CSERT, who is my contact at the critical infrastructure bureau or service provider CSERT there? Who is my point of contact there? And then also other government entities as well. You would want to have all this information here. So as we mentioned, this could be part of the NCIRP, or it could be its own standalone document that is pulled to be used when necessary. You would also identify here who are the key stakeholders. Is it all critical infrastructures? So we have to be able to identify who these are, and this all comes to back to something that we were talking about yesterday, whereas building relationships within the sector, and also working with the NCSA and the National CSERT once it is fully established, as to who are key stakeholders within the sector and how this communication is going to look like. And this communication tree normally is what it's called. And then any backups for each contact should also be recorded. So if I can't get a hold of the person that is identified as the POC here, who then can I contact to identify or to notify that there is something that needs their attention? The contact list should be available digitally and physically as well. And do we want to do a break now? Do we want to wait till I'm done with the next slides? Okay. We'll keep going. Okay, so when distributing information, plan for multiple distribution mechanisms. Be sure the stakeholders understand what to do with the information and consider having an archive. So similarly, how we are collecting information from the stakeholders, either through the web portal, an email, phone call, or even through an app, how are we going to distribute information or notify our stakeholders that something has occurred? So would it be through an SMS message? Whoops, can we go back, please? Would it be through, as we have some examples here, we can do a mass texting of a large-scale incident has occurred. We could do it through phone calls. We could do it through an update on our website. We could do it even through, we have here, social media. And we could do it through either a public announcement, through some type of a conference, depending on the type of incident that has occurred. So when we start to create the NSERP and what information is going to go in here and go into this, we have to think about, how do we want this to work, and how do we want this all to function, at a high level. Next slide, please. And then some information sharing strategies and requirements. So these would be either in the NCIRP or as a reference. Any specific type of information sharing should be done, should be documented and explained. Of key importance are the type of information that will be shared, the mechanism or platform for sharing, timeframes for sharing, and requirements for sharing. So when we start to talk about information sharing, we have to think about how we are going to do this, and how this will be dependent on the classification of the information that's being shared, the type of event or incident that happened, and the specific agency that may have been affected. So this will all impact on what is shared and how it is shared. So we have to be aware of that as well. So when we talk about type of information that will be shared, what is it that we can share? Can we say that some type of agency or critical infrastructure service provider got some type of event happened? Do we name them, or do we keep them anonymous? It's one thing to consider. Are we able to get into real details as to what happened with the event? Was it a data breach? Was it some type of malware installation? Was it the detection of a long-term advanced persistent threat? So what information can we share? But we have to identify this again. It should be related to and relate back to incident classification. Mechanisms or platform for sharing. You should all identify the mechanism that you will be using for sharing. And I think that right now you are at a good place to determine this as you're working towards creating the National Incident Response Plan and the establishment of the National CSIR. So should the National CSIR determined to utilize a specific tool, they could then have the authority possibly to dictate to all the other sectors, this is what we're going to use, this is what you should use as well, and this would eliminate any incompatibilities
ไม่
as
อาจ
we
ปลุก
move
ปลอบส
forward in
มา
the
ธิอันแจ่ม
future
ใส
through
ได้
information
แม้
sharing
จะไม่
as
มี
we
ลม
develop
แต่
our
มีกลิ่นหอม
information
จางๆ
sharing
โชยมาเป็นระยะ
ecosystem.
ระยะ
Also,
ส่วน
you
ตัวของ
will
หม้อยูก้าตอนนั้น
identify here
ภายใต้
time
แสง
frames
ผิว
for
อันเรือน
sharing.
ราง
So maybe
ตา
based
อาบ
on
ไว้ความ
the
เร้นราน
type
เป็น
of
ส
incident
งบ
that has
ดวง
occurred,
ตาประกายสุขใส
we
มือ
must
เรีย
share
งยาวนุ่ม
immediately
นิ่มนวล
because it
ใย
could bring down a
ซึ่งใน
specific
สายตาของเซล
sector
ล์ยีตอนนั้นน่ะ
or
เขารู้
specific
สึก
key
ว่า
players in a
นี่เป็น
specific
ความ
sector.
งามที่อยู่เหนือระดับมนุษย์ปุถุชนทั่วไป
These time frames would be
พอเห็น
again
หม้อยงก้าในบรร
related
ยากาศ
to
แบบ
the
เนี้ย
type of
มันก็ชวนให้
event
เขา
or
นึกไป
incident
ถึ
that
ง
has
ต
occurred
อนที่เขาเห็น
and
ร่า
the
งของเรือป่า
criticality
ขุนนางใน
of
ห้อง
the
น้ำแข็ง
incident
บรร
and
ยากาศ
the
ทุกอย่างเป็น
criticality
ใจ
of the
ให้เขา
agency
เกิดความรู้สึก
or
อันชั่วร้ายชนิด
service
หนึ่งเกิด
critical
ขึ้น
infrastructure service provider
เขาก็เลยบ
that's
อกให้
being
นางถอด
affected.
เสื้อผ้าออก
And
เพื่
then
อป
what
ก
are the
เรื่องพันธนา
requirements
การ
for
จากปี
sharing?
ศาจร้าย
So if
ตอนนั้น
we're
นางก็
going
ยั
to
ง
share
ลังเลอยู่
information
นะ
back and forth,
เซลล์ยีก็เลย
we
ฉุด
need to
ร่าง
have
นางออกมาใน
encryption.
อ้อมกอด
What type of
นางเองก็ไม่ได้
encryption
ขัด
are we
ขืน
going
แม้
to
แต่น้อย
have?
จังหวะนั้น
That
เขา
needs
ก็
to
เลย
be
คิดเข้าข้างตัว
identified.
เองว่า
You should have document
เมื่อมี
markings.
คนผู้
So
ห
the
นึ่ง
data that
ตั้
I'm
งใจ
going to be
ทำร้ายเขา
sharing
ถึง
with
แก่
you
ชีวิต
should
ดังนั้น
be
ไม่ว่าเขาจะเอาคืนคนผู้นั้นอย่างไง
tagged
มันก็คงจะไม่
or
เกินเลยไปหรอก
labeled
มั้ง
with a specific
แต่ว่า
criticality
ตอนนั้น
level
น่ะแมงมุม
that
ดำ
could
เข้า
be
มาขัดจัง
that
หวะซะ
we
ก่
can
อน
track
ก็เลย
also
ไม่
and
ได้เกิ
keep
ดอะไรขึ้น
better control of this information.
แต่จังหวะ
And
ต่อ
then
มา
through the
หลัง
use
จาก
of
ที่แมงมุมดำ
traffic
เนี่ยไป
light
แล้ว
protocol as well as
เซ
we
ลล์ยีก็
mentioned
หันกลับ
yesterday.
มาเห็นว่าหม้อยงก้าเนี่ยยืนเปลือยกายล่อนจ้อนอยู่
I saw a
นี่เป็น
hand
ค
go
รั้ง
up and
ที่
then
ส
I
อง
saw it
แล้
go
ว
away. We
ที่
can
เขาเห็นนาง
do
แก้ผ้า
questions
ทั้
in
ง
a
ตัวแบ
minute,
บนี้
or maybe we can save that towards the end, and we can do a question and answer. And I think we're going to do a break now.
Yes, we have a 10-minute break now. And when we come back, we'll do the wrap up of the components.
Okay. Thanks, Robin.
Okay, we'll be getting ready to get started again. So we'll start back up in another minute. Okay, the next component that we want to spend a little bit of time on is workflows. Now, this could be an optional part of your National Cyber Incident Response Plan, but we found that these can be very helpful, so it's something that you may want to consider. So when we talk about this, this really is looking at all the different types of interactions, collaborations, communications with others, and also any type of stakeholders like we mentioned before, as far as disaster recovery responders, even breach response activities. We've seen different times where the whole breach response for unauthorized exfiltration of data or access to citizen data sometimes is handled with a specific type of breach response versus an incident response plan. So in case that is the situation, either at the local level or even at the national level, that's something that should be considered too. And as we look at the workflows as far as who's doing what, it's really laying out, who's responsible for what type of actions. There are additional documents that can be developed for specific types of incidents and how to handle those incidents. We usually call that playbooks. And there may be some very high-level, critical, severe types of national incidents or incidents of national importance that there may be a additional incident playbook developed. It's probably not going to be developed initially when the original NCIRP is developed, but it's something to think about for the future. The other thing to think about with having the workflows and any type of incident playbook, and just for your NCIRP in general, is, as we said, the plan by itself is not enough. And as the plan is finalized and approved, or even before it's finalized and approved, think about testing out the practices in it, the escalation path, the requirements in it. Can be some voluntary organizations with a scenario for a high-level incident of national importance, and then see how well the NCIRP holds up as you're practicing that scenario. It can identify for you who was left out of communication, what type of information didn't you know, what type of tools did you need. It can be very helpful in doing your improvements for your plan. When we're looking at the workflow for incident handling, again, looking back to those high-level areas related to the NIST Special Publication 861, the Cybersecurity Incident Handling Guidance, we're really thinking about those processes and how and what we use to handle any incident that's been received. So the workflow should outline and determine who's responsible for the different activities, who's going to perform them, where there are handoffs to other entities, and if there's any time frames involved. So if an incident is received, determining the type of incident, and as we said, the impact, the incident classification severity, what type of communication, collaboration, and notification has to occur. And as Angel mentioned before, very important to identify who is the lead. We've seen it happen where two different levels of CSERT are trying to handle an incident. Each one thinks that they're leading the activity. So that's something that has to be laid out. What incidents are handled at what level, by what team, or what personnel within what team, and when there's escalation, when there's assistance, or even surge support. What backups do you have if an incident is overwhelming? And are there other organizations, other CSERTs who can have people that you're familiar with, who understand the National Cyber Incident Response Plan and can help in the escalation and the analysis and provide that surge support for handling that incident too. And again, so this really just says all the things that we talked about in the previous modules, lay that out in some type of a workflow or some type of flow chart. And that oftentimes can help people understand the actual activities and the incident response process better. Besides a flow chart, sometimes people will use a swim lane. This is just a notional representation. I would not follow this one. It's just trying to show some different examples. You can see some of the stakeholders from system users, local CSERT, national CSERT, law enforcement, National Security Council, any external experts, and then where their information or the incident is passed between organizations or between stakeholders and who's responsible for what. So that can be also a good way to document workflows. We've seen people take things like Visio, tools like Visio, and actually do different types of flow charts for that. We've seen these workflows often be added as appendices to national cyber incident response plans or local incident response plans too. So as we wrap up, we'll talk about the challenges and in some of the ideas that you put forward in the Mentimeter question that related to misalignment of cybersecurity capabilities and strategies. We'll see some of the same things come up. So if you would go to the last polling question for Mentimeter for this module 3, and it will ask you, what do you think are the biggest challenges to a successful national incident response plan? Now, we're giving you some options to choose from, but you can also put in the chat any other challenges not listed. And Angel, I'll ask you to let me know if anything goes in chat as far as any additional challenges. So Joanna, I'll turn it over to you to bring up the information, and the link and the code is on the bottom of this question. So we're getting some more people answering the question. We're seeing a lot go in the duplication or unclear roles and responsibilities. That one is leading by far. And it's interesting because that is actually something that we found as we worked with many different organizations that are building a computer security incident response team at both a national and a local level. That leaving out the definition of roles and responsibilities really caused a lot of issues, not only duplication of effort, but actually ineffective operation, lack of standardization. So that unclear roles and responsibilities could cause a lot of some of the other problems too. So that is definitely something that we've seen is very important to include in any incident response plan, clearly laying out the roles and responsibilities. It looks like lack of staff and lack of expertise, which kind of go hand in hand often, are also problems. And I think we're all experiencing, and we've been experiencing, lack of staff and lack of expertise very often because there are just not enough people with cybersecurity and especially incident response expertise to fill all the positions that are there. Okay, very good, very good. Angel, was there anything added in the chat that isn't on our list here?
No, but I don't see anything in the chat.
Okay, great. Thank you, Joanna. And I will now bring back up my slides. And thank you all for participating with that. So we already walked through and talked about some of these. One of the ones that is most difficult, I think, to deal with is the political stovepipes or political silos. And it doesn't have to be political in nature. It can also be based on what the type of organization is and what their responsibilities are. And very often, they don't want to share information because they're trying to protect information. But we've also seen that, important as the roles and responsibilities are, one of the other areas, whoever's responsible for implementing and maintaining the incident response plan doesn't have the authority and the responsibility to do that clearly articulated, that can cause a lot of issues too. So when we talk about the role of critical infrastructures in developing a national cyber incident response plan, this really ties into your role and some of the things you should think about as far as the development of that NCIRP. And so you want to make sure that what your needs are identified and put forward, so those leading the effort understand what you need for incident response, incident coordination, any type of assistance you might need in building your capacity, in building your own local incident response plan, or even helping you identify if there are particular playbooks you need to develop. And there are guidance out there by other organizations that can give you some examples of playbooks or some ideas for the basic framework of that. It's really up to you as the critical infrastructure to make sure you know your requirements, you know your key critical assets. So you need to be able to identify those and share them with whoever is responsible for the National Cyber Strategy and the National Cyber Incident Response Plan, because of the fact that the more that's known about the assets, their criticality, any impacts, if there's anything that disrupts them, known in advance can help plan a more effective response. So that you need to be able to identify that and also keep up to date any points of contact. And then as reviewing the National Cyber Incident Response Plan, get some agreement, provide your feedback. It probably should be feedback rather than agreement, because we know not everybody can reach 100% agreement, but provide your own feedback on the reporting requirements and how feasible they are, what type of collaboration and coordination is needed, and again, any assistance. And just the whole overall National Cyber Incident Response Plan. And then look at the owners of the NCIRP need to reach out to the critical infrastructures and their sectors to help them understand how they can work with the National CSIRT or other government and cybersecurity organizations, what kind of specific requirements that the critical infrastructures might have to meet so that they understand why they need to meet them and what they are. Any type of specific reporting requirements. Critical infrastructures may have different reporting requirements than commercial organizations because of the importance of their work. And also, as far as developing your own local CCERT team and your own local incident response plan and any other supporting processes and procedures and playbooks. So again, think about what you need to do at your end to match at the local level and to tie into the national level incident response plan. So as we wrap up, think about all the different items that we covered in the past sections of this module and apply that to what is laid out in the Thailand Cyber Capacity Building Action Plan. And says that for the next steps, you need to identify and define those roles of the stakeholders and the critical infrastructure sectors. We've given you some ideas of the types of stakeholders and some of the different activities. And so thinking about those roles and requirements as far as reporting, communications, information sharing, escalation. Develop a cyber incident severity scheme. There are many different ways that you can lay out severity levels. So think about those that would work best based on and aligned with those 3 levels that are outlined in the Cybersecurity Act of 2019. Then draft, and it should be review, provide feedback, and implement. And don't forget to test. Do some exercises to see that the plan actually works. And those are the things that are laid out that Thailand wants to do in its next steps for National Cyber Incident Response Plan. So we have a couple wrap-up slides, too, that kind of takes a look at a lot of the things that were talked about over the past 3 days and puts it into kind of a foundational framework. We look at, if you're understanding the cybersecurity issues and the tie between the national and the local level, thinking about what is the cybersecurity strategy at the local level, at the national level. What is laid out as those priorities in the cybersecurity strategy? What critical infrastructures are important? What type of risk-focused approach can be used? What is the governance framework? Remember the cybersecurity commission, legal and policy framework, cybersecurity laws, cybercrime laws, and any other type of compliance. And you can start to fill in these blocks to better understand the foundational aspects that are going to help you build your national cyber incident response plan. And then what are the capabilities, the cybersecurity capabilities that are needed, and where specifically are those incident management, incident response ones? Here's an example from the Netherlands and looking at some of their documentation that they have as far as their strategic objectives and their cybersecurity strategy. They did a cybersecurity assessment and had some findings, and they put that in, and we could pull that into the risk-focused approach. And they also had different governance frameworks for cyber crimes legislation and a personal data protection law, so trying to understand that. And then the types of capabilities that they're offering through their cybersecurity center. And what we've put in this slide are one for you to fill in yourself with your ideas for the Thailand NCIRP. And also we've added a piece on the bottom to say, what do you want to see, needed or required components in the NCIRP specific to your critical infrastructure sector and your actual organization? And then the same thing as far as your local or organizational IRP. So just some things that you can use to kind of coordinate your thoughts, collect your thoughts for feedback that you want to provide. So we said that the NCIRP provides guidance to enable that coordinated whole of nation approach to response and activities. We've said multiple times it has to align with existing strategies and existing laws and any other national cyber documents. We want to make sure that the plan is discussed and authorized where possible in the cybersecurity strategy and referenced in cybersecurity laws, that the authority is put in there clearly, that the National Cyber Incident Response Plan has the authority for operation. We want to make sure from the beginning we include our stakeholders and constituents in building the plan, getting their ideas, their needs, their requirements, and then getting them to review and provide feedback on the plan. We know that it has to be customized for each country and its set of stakeholders, but think about the fact that we're looking to have a standardization of definitions, your incident criteria, and optionally, but very helpful, those workflows. So other pieces that can go in there. Test it, test out, making sure you have the instructions, test it, and ensure the coordination and escalation activities, tying the local and national incident response entities is included. So that wraps us up for the discussion today. If you have any questions, we can put those in the chat, and those of us from the SCI will be able to answer those. And I want to turn it over to Joanna now, because we want to see now what has happened with Mr. Dingbang, and he's going to be talking with a new stakeholder, the head of the National Incident Response Team, Mr. Kim. It's all yours, Joanna.
Thank you, Robin. And hello, everyone. Very nice to connect with you again tonight. And I am back with you to follow the adventures of Mr. Dingbang. So we are going to jump right to our chapter for the evening. And just as a reminder for anyone who has not joined us earlier this week, Mr. Dingbang is our main character. He is a manager in the Infrastructure Security Division in the Cyber Security Agency in his nation. He is responsible for outreach to critical infrastructure owners and operators, and for helping them to plan and implement, or plan and provide, their cybersecurity and privacy programs. Last night, we learned that Mr. Dingbang received an angry phone call from a personal friend named Miss Sabai, and Miss Sabai is the chief administrator at the largest hospital complex in the capital city. And she was quite upset because her complex had just been hit with a ransomware attack. It was the third attack in 18 months. She's frustrated because the malware came from another medical entity who had been hit several days previously. She didn't hear that. Her security team didn't hear that. There didn't seem to be any information sharing. And she was calling her friend, knowing that he has responsibility in that space, to say, hey, what are you doing? What is the government doing? Why does this keep happening? And that's where we left Mr. Dingbang yesterday. So let's pick up and see how he's handling that situation and what he's going to do next. So Mr. Dingbang realizes that the recurring ransomware attacks in the health sector are quite possibly contributing to reduced wellness and even potential loss of life for Canardra's citizens. The nation is in the grip of a global pandemic, and its healthcare system is overtaxed. Mr. Dingbang decides that any other potential risk to a hospital's ability to care for its patients must be considered a serious national concern. He is determined to mobilize a national response to the ongoing attacks on the health sector. I'm going to pause for just a minute and just call to your attention that, remember, Mr. Dingbang has authority for outreach to critical infrastructure owners and operators. So he has some pretty ambitious plans here to mobilize a national response. He first contacts Mr. Kim, the director of KCERT, the National Incident Response Team. Mr. Kim agrees that there has been an alarming number of incident reports from the health sector over the last year. And while KCERT is doing the best it can to keep up, it too is overworked and under-resourced. Mr. Dingbang then contacts the director of ISD, his Infrastructure Security Division, who is sympathetic and offers to bring the issue to the Cybersecurity Agency Directors meeting later that week. At that meeting, the other directors agree that action is wise, but they need approval from the executive branch of government to take any national level action or to task any other agencies. So what we have here are several well-intentioned players. Mr. Dingbang is certainly well-intentioned. Mr. Kim agrees that this is an issue, but he's limited in his resources. We also don't know what authorities Mr. Kim has. The director of the Infrastructure Security Division is sympathetic and pushes the request up the authority chain, and other directors agree that this is an issue, but they need input from the executive branch to do anything. So that is where we are tonight. Let's go to our Mentimeter slides and look at our first question. So we're asking, what is the most concerning problem that you see in this chapter? So think back to what you've learned tonight about response planning at the national level, maybe what you learned last night about information sharing, or maybe even what we heard on the first night about risk and strategic risk management. What do you think is the most concerning problem that you see tonight? And I will switch over to our poll results so we can watch the responses. Okay. So we have a couple of really good answers already. Roles and responsibility problems. We're seeing again that lack of resources and lack of staff. Lack of authority of the CSA director. No clear authorized person or entity, and no plan. These are all good answers. Robin or Angel, would you maybe like to comment? Early on in your presentation, you touched on some of the key components that we need for a national cyber incident response plan. And you mentioned things like authority for operations, an escalation plan, respecting affected entities. We weren't seeing a lot of those at all in this chapter. Do you have any comments, or could you maybe share any thoughts on some other key components that you thought were either missing or maybe that you did see in this scenario?
Thanks, Joanna. I actually think that the answers that people are giving in the Mentimeter really are hitting on a lot of the things that we think that we're missing. The big thing was, and I think a few people identified this, is there was no plan. That basically they were trying to handle things without really having outlined what was a standardized fashion, who should contact who, in what way, what was the incident response, they knew that some people were responsible for certain things, but it was not coordinated. So maybe in answer to your questions, like there is the national team, but who was responsible for letting people know about things? Who should have contacted people and in what way? So there were some pieces that were kind of being done ad hoc, but the real problem was there was no coordinated approach that was standardized. At least that's what I think from this scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. And we just saw a comment from our audience that there was doesn't seem to be any risk analysis or risk plan in place, and certainly had a risk plan been put in place, we can imagine that the health sector may have bubbled up to the top, if not near the top of that list, given the global situation. And so we could potentially even say that maybe some of this could have been preempted slightly if Mr. Dingbang and his friends at KCERT and potentially even in the sector would have had a little more foresight. That's another issue that was pointed out by our audience. All good comments. Let's go to the next question.
And Joanna, if I could add too, I think one of the other big problems I see in this scenario is that for them to get what they need in a proactive manner in place is going to take a while. Mm-hmm. So they said there's executive approvals. If you're going to write a plan, I mean, we know how much goes into that, even setting up any type of information sharing platforms. And so the problem becomes, what can they do right now? And I think those are your next.
Yes, you're absolutely right. That's a great segue. And in fact, let's go ahead and kind of skip over to some of those what can they do right now questions, because I think here, and when we were asking what problems could have been avoided, I think many of the comments from our last question actually touched on that. So for the interest of time, let's go to some of those more immediate questions. So just thinking about Mr. Dingbang and what authority he has or maybe doesn't have, what we've learned about him in the past 2 nights, his good intentions. What else can he do in this situation? What does he have the authority and the capability to do? And maybe think back to some of the comments this week about, or tonight about how response plans can come into how the roles and responsibilities can be outlined. Maybe think about the mission space that Mr. Dingbang has. What do you think he should do in this situation that we haven't already discussed? And I might call on Barbara. What do you think? Could you maybe get us kicked off here?
Sure. Thanks, Joanna. So I think if we had sort of our CISA friends here with us, one of their things would be saying, well, he should be writing some kind of an alert out to everyone, at least in the health sector, but probably to the other key sectors, because often the same kinds of things, there might be ransomware first in the health sector, but they could go on to the next sector as well. And so why isn't he writing up some alerts and giving people advice? If you might remember the slide last night on information sharing, and talked about how that one where they had the individual had gotten someone infected, but that individual had sent a note to the central people who sent it out to everyone else, and so they could be protected. So getting out information about what do the attacks look like, What are the TTPs, the tactics, techniques, and procedures that are being used? What are the things you can do to mitigate against it? So without actually having to solve the problem for everyone, by giving everyone information that they can help themselves, I think that that's number one. The number two, it surprised me, given how serious this was, that when he spoke to his friend at ICD, his ICD friend said, well, I'll bring it to the CSA director later this week.
Mm-hmm.
Later this week is not good enough. When you've got something that it's going back to Robin's point about severity schemas, clearly this is critical and probably crisis level. The head of CSA should not learn about it later that week, should have learned about it in the first minute they heard about it.
Yeah, I agree. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Barbara. Sorry.
No, I was saying over.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, another thought I had was I thought it was interesting that the director level of the CSA had to hear this from Mr. Dingbang rather than from Mr. Kim, as far as we know. So certainly there's some communication breakdowns there that could also lead to or lend itself to that kind of unclear roles and responsibilities as well. Matt, anything else to add on what you think Mr. Dingbang might be able to do?
Sure. Is my mic okay?
It is. Thank you.
Okay, great. So, yeah, I really like, this well-informed and you can tell experienced group through the chat box. And one of the things that keeps pounding through is authorities. From my experience running this kind of at a regional or international scale, it really comes down to that. So Mr. Dingbat has to understand his authorities, because somewhere there are some national resources to leverage. I would guess that this incident would land somewhere in the critical, in that severity matrix. And again, as we heard yesterday, there's those malware tools, that framework with the traffic light protocol. This is very high. Always the struggle is to figure out who has the authorities to take action. So the immediate, I think, responses would include gathering those stakeholders, the folks with the authorities that can leverage those national assets. I kind of see that's what are the suggestions there, and that's what I would really lean on. There's a leadership aspect to this, the authorities of it, and if he doesn't have the authority to reach those assets and get that information out quickly, find the right people. And these are great suggestions coming across the line.
Yeah,
I think that oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, please, Robin, go ahead.
I was going to say, I agree with what Matt was saying and also what Barbara was saying. And I really like the one in the chat that says call war room. And I think that's kind of getting to what Matt was saying. If they're allowed to work together, and that was a little unclear, could they take some actions by themselves? But there's some things that they could do even if they can't. And so you'd want Mr. Kim and Mr. Dingbat to start working together to help lay out, so much to do. Can they kind of split some of the things? So can Mr. Dingbat, for example, maybe contact some of the other hospitals to see if they're affected, or some of his staff, so that they get better statistics in? Can they pull together and lay out what should we do at this point? So for this particular occurrence, here's the response that we think, like what Barbara was saying. But also, if there's other resources out there, like Matt was saying, maybe this is already a known ransomware issue. Maybe there's already written by other people, here's the steps to take. And so you can pull that stuff. You could create information on the website. You can create a frequently asked questions. We've done that very often when we have so many questions coming in and we don't have enough staff to cover it. we have someone pull all that information together in a frequently asked questions that we can put that on our website. We can email it to people who are emailing about the incident report. We can share it with some of the stakeholders, and you can look to see who else knows about this, and is there already published materials that we could use. So there's that whole side of it. And at the same time, poor Mr. Dingbat, I think he should also be thinking about the fact that down the line, he's going to have to do these proactive things. They're going to need the plan, and they're going to need the interaction. So they need to start capturing the lessons learned too. While it's occurring, maybe there's someone on his staff that can help with that, or maybe he can pull in surge support from some of the other people in the organization, because he's only responsible for one part of that organization. So there may be other people. We've done that too, where I've had the time where I was working on a training course, and I came in that day and I was told, stop working on your training course. We got to go handle this incident. So maybe there's some surge support that they could do, but it's all going to come down to what they're allowed to do too. But even if they're not allowed to work together, they could definitely get the public resources and make those available in an FAQ on the website or in an advisory or alert, like Barbara was saying.
Yeah, absolutely. All really good feedback. Barbara, what do you think? Should we do one more question, or do we need to go ahead and do closing remarks? We've got about 5 more minutes.
You've got time for one more question.
Okay. All right. So, Barbara, we're going to flip a coin. Do we want to find out what Mr. Kim should do, or do we want to put the spotlight on Ms. Sabai and the sector and what they should do?
Let's go to Ms. Sabai, because I think she got off pretty easy last night and seemed like the victim, and I think she had some responsibilities.
I agree with you. Good choice. So audience, Ms. Sabai, we can assume that because her hospital complex is the largest in the nation's capital, we can assume that she is probably on that critical infrastructure hot list. She just called and complained. We haven't heard of what she's trying to do to help the situation. Thinking back to the section we just heard in critical infrastructure owners and operators being the main constituents of a national cyber incident response plan, what do you think she should be doing? And Robin or Angel, please go ahead and jump in if you would like to start us off here while we're waiting for our audience.
Well, I think the very first task that is mentioned here is like something has to be done within the hospital. Whether they're going to get information from other people or not, they need to decide what their strategy is going to be just internally while they're waiting. So I think that activate their incident response plan if they have one, but determine what their strategy is. Are they going to have to, do they have their backups in place that they can restore things? Do they have special IT or cybersecurity people that can be pulled in to help deal with this? So that's at least something that they can get started with, and to do that temporary strategy. And then also collecting what they know has happened so that she can share what happened at their organization, either now with others or in the future, so that they can be ready to share information.
And Robin, I would also add, they could maybe do some awareness training. They keep having a reoccurring ransomware attack that we know could be coming in through some type of phishing attempt. So they could also maybe launch some kind of awareness campaign to alert people that this is happening and be more cautious of what they're doing with their email. Over.
That's a great idea, Angel.
Yeah, absolutely. All good suggestions. And this comment to that she could help identify the information that needs to be shared. Certainly, we know that she has a security team. We can assume that they may have some, if not sophisticated forensics abilities, they could even share even potentially indicators of compromise that for others in the sector may be useful. They could potentially gather some of that information and offer it to others too, whether that's through their own channels or through KCERT. Well, thank you, everyone. We are just 1 minute before our hour, so I'm going to stop us here. Barbara, I will turn it back over to you for some closing comments. And everyone, I will see you again next week, and we will continue our adventure here. Thank you very much.
Joanna, do you have the objectives Mentimeter poll?
Yes, I do. There you go. It should be up.
Great. Let me show again our session objectives. And so if you could all go to the Mentimeter poll and let us know how well we did tonight in answering these objectives. And if we didn't, let us know how we could do a better job. So we've really done covered a lot this week, starting with strategic risk management. We talked about information sharing and stakeholders. We talked about incident response plan. We're going to pick up next week talking about creating a CSIRT. So we're continuing on this response trajectory, and how do we effectively create CSIRTs to do that? So I think that we should look forward to that. Thank you again for all of you joining us today. And we appreciate that. And we look forward to having you with us next week as we continue on doing our going through these 6 sessions. And I think, Captain Jadette, you wanted to possibly say a few words to our participants before we say good night or good day.
Yeah. Thank you, Barbara. I learned a lot today. I feel that I and Mr. Ding Bang very closely to be the same person. And so thank you so much for everything. The content you provide us today is very useful, not only for MCSA, but for most of the participants today or tonight. And let me talk in Thai with Thai people a little bit. ก่อนอื่นนะครับก็วันนี้เป็นวันที่3แล้วนะครับที่มีการอบรมกับทาง Mitre นะครับแล้วก็ทีม Mitre ทีม CISA ทีม SCI นะครับเขาตั้งใจมากๆนะครับสังเกตว่าตัวเนื้อหาที่เขานำเสนอเราในวันนี้ก็เป็นเนื้อหาที่เขาคัสตอมไมซ์มานะครับเขาศึกษามาอย่างดีนะครับเพราะฉะนั้นผมหวังเป็นอย่างยิ่งว่านะครับวันนี้ทุกท่านที่เข้ามาร่วมการอบรมด้วยกันนะครับน่าจะได้รับมุมมองได้รับประโยชน์โดยเฉพาะเป็น practice ที่เขาผ่านการปฏิบัติมานักต่อนักแล้วครับก็น่าจะสามารถได้บางมุมมองกลับไปนะครับผมหวังเป็นอย่างนั้นนะครับแล้วก็อาจจะเน้นย้ำอีกครั้งหนึ่งครับว่าถ้ามีส่วนไหนนะครับที่ท่านอยากได้เพิ่มเติมนะครับอยากให้ทีมสกมช.ช่วยประสานงานให้ก็ยินดีนะครับแล้วก็ติดต่อมาที่ทางพวกผมทางฝ่ายเลขาได้เลยนะครับแล้วก็ถ้าท่านรู้สึกประทับใจนะครับท่านก็say thank you เข้าไปในแชทนะครับก็จะเป็นการให้กำลังใจทีมงานของเขานะครับ Okay, that's all from me. Thank you so much everybody, and I want to say goodbye and good night for everybody. See you next week. Bye.
Bye bye. See you next week.
Bye bye.